So Deborah Sandy is passionate about both her mother and her father's country. Deborah continues on this journey for recognition and justice for her people through the Federal Court of Australia native title processes, and hopes in future for proper assistance and support, which we are very hopeful of. She also has a long and ongoing association with Will. Please welcome Auntie Debbie Sandy.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And hi to everybody at home. Like that's in, what do we call this here? Zoom link up meeting. Yes, good evening.
Hello.
Hello. So yeah, those of you who don't know me, my name is Deborah Sandy, and I'm a daughter of Uncle Des Sandy. If any of you have been fortunate enough to meet my dad, Uncle Des, and that, so, and you know, so he's Brisbane dad, and then my mum and her people and country are from Mount Tambourine, so you can bear our language for there. So that's a little bit of history about me, and I lived and grew up in Brisbane, New Farm all my life, and then I'm head men whom I like to acknowledge here on country, and that is, you know, for Northside is Bungaree, Megan Bungaree, or the King Sandys of Brisbane. You know, the birthing place and where they're born, right in Brisbane City. Meanjin, traditional Aboriginal name we call that, and Botanical Gardens, right there, Garden Point, where they built, like, you know, the Parliament House and the garden area. So that's where the ancestor Meanjin, like in this here, the shape of a spear or the spike, this top end, and that's the Meanjin. So, you know, as the river bends and have all of those, you know, Meanjins and the bends throughout the river. So a river is what we call the Warrell, and for the north side too, and also a mountain here, and that is Cootha, which is Mount Cootha, which is just up here where they have all the TV channels and that. Home and place of the native honeybee, and that, which is stingless, you know, like the native honeybees and that. So women's area and women's place, and that Meanjin CBD, right down to Breakfast Creek. You know, for those of you who don't know, John Oxley, when he sailed up the river, he stopped and had breakfast there, and so they called it Breakfast Creek. You know, that's why they named it Breakfast Creek. And that's so down to Breakfast Creek, and you know, back again to Cootha, and that other area is women's place and area. And the men would be camped up at you know, Wickham Terrace and Gregory Terrace, so and Upper Romulus Street. So you know, you can look down the river and see if any enemies and people in passing, and so they could keep an eye on the women and children down below. So that's women used to, you know, have battles up there also in the Romulus Street, where the parklands are. Corroboree grounds, well, the closest ones here to this place is Mount Cootha, where they have the Toowong. Yeah, they have the cemetery that's there. That used to be ceremonial grounds, and where the people used to go and do corroboree and you know, do shake a leg and have meetings, and the meeting place here at Toowong. So that's a bit of history for Southside, Northside. And the Southside, I like to acknowledge the ancestors, and for Southside, you may have heard of Jackie, King Jackie, or Billin, but just his traditional name, and that, as we know, Billin, which is Pee-wee. So he's the regional headman for Southside, and we're known as the Urongapan clan for the Southside. So, you know, that goes from South Bank all the way to Ipswich and down to, you know, Mount Barney, and then back to Logan again. So that there's a Urongapan clan and country. And those two regional headmen had children, and those children married, see? So that's why I have rights both sides of the river, north and south. And so that's a little bit about his, and same sharing language in that, which is the Yuggera language. So that's a bit of history in that about me, who I am. So before I do a customary welcome, it's customary for me to know all your fellas' name and where you all come from. So on the count of three, can you please call out the name? Yeah. So 1, 2, 3.
Tarragindi.
Tarragindi, I got it. So on behalf of the Yagara Chippa people, Deborah Sandy here, welcome each and every one of you here tonight, including everybody here that's on the internet. So good evening and Baboka, welcome. Welcome each and every one of you here, and like the stars of the Southern Cross, which help to guide and unite us, which brought each and every one of us here to the sacred place on which we meet. Baboka, and good evening, and thank you very much. And I'd love to stay, but now I've got to go to State Library because the Wilderness Society and volunteers for all of our beautiful animals and wildlife. I have an event to do, so I'm up there at 16.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Auntie Deb, and thank you, Valerie, and thank you everyone here for your enthusiasm. We will now move on to hearing from Jem and Dimity in ICAN, Australia. Over to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Greetings. Good evening to the room there in Meanjin, Brisbane. Wonderful to be with you, and good evening to everybody online as well. We are here for the 3rd out of 4 ICAN Australia hubs for Nuclear Ban Week, and it's wonderful to be back. We're now over halfway through the big week of events, with the 2nd day of the first meeting of states parties to the ban treaty just beginning right now. And happily, there is a delegation of 3 Australian government representatives there in the audience, attending, seated and listening. So that is fantastic. And hello also to the Brisbane Hub, and thank you to the incredible WILF Australia team for everything that you have done to bring this together. And of course, Marianne Hanson, ICAN Australia co-chair, emceeing the gathering in person tonight. So I think the sound is working. I think you can hear me. So we're doing this hybrid event and we are good to keep rolling. This is currently being recorded and live streamed to YouTube so that we have a record of it. And tonight we have 3 special guests joining us from Vienna, as well as our anchor there, Jemila Rushton, who has many friends in the room in Brisbane.
Right.
Hey.
So after Jemila begins with her hot take of what's going on, our first guest is also a really close friend of many of us in ICAN Australia and to WILF members all over the world. And that, of course, is Ray Acheson. Ray, hello. Ray is the Director of Disarmament for WILF, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and they also serve on the International Steering Group or multiple steering groups for ICAN, the Stop Killer Robots campaign, and the International Network on Explosive Weapons. Ray is also the author of one of the most definitive and really compelling accounts of the campaign to achieve the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And that's the title of that. The excellent title is Banning the Bomb, Smashing the Patriarchy. And that came out in 2021. And Ray also has a new book titled Abolishing State Violence, A World Beyond Bombs, Borders and Cages. And that will be published by Haymarket Books next month. Over to you, Dimity.
So we're thrilled also to have 2 other speakers with us tonight. The next speaker will be Rico Ishii Robertson from Peace Boat in Japan. As a 3rd generation Habakusha from Hiroshima, Rico has worked for nuclear abolition with a number of organizations and individuals in countries including Costa Rica, the Philippines, Australia, and Japan, prior to joining Peace Boat as an international coordinator. Rico has also been a close friend to ICAN Australia. She worked with CCWA back in 2011, just after the Fukushima disaster, organizing a Hiroshima event in Perth with Mia. Rico has attended ANFA and WANFA meetings while she was living in Australia 10 years ago, and she was inspired by the work of Australian people. She also spent some time in Jabiru working with Gundjeihmi Aboriginal Corporation and joined the Nuclear Futures Project and went to Yalata community for 2 weeks, lucky to attend the festival there in 2014 to commemorate community forcibly relocated by Australian government from Maralinga. And then next, as if that wasn't enough already, then next we are so lucky to have Benedict Kabua Madison joining us. Benedict was born in Majuro Atoll in the Marshall Islands, but now lives in Arkansas, with the highest concentration of Marshallese reside in continental USA. He is the Assistant Director and Project Specialist for Youth, Climate and Nuclear Issues with the Marshallese Education Initiative. His work with them includes raising educational attainment levels for Marshallese residents, and he regularly speaks about the ongoing consequences of the nuclear legacy and climate change on his homelands at conferences and events in the US and internationally. Benedict is also a student at Arkansas State University, pursuing a degree in political science. After our 3 speakers in Vienna, we will turn quickly to hear what is happening at tonight's in-person hub in Meanjin, Brisbane. Hello, you all. Where there are campaigners and special guests, including Terri Butler, the former member for Griffith, academic and author Emeritus Professor Ian Lowe, Major retired Cameron Leckie, the chair of the Independent and Peaceful Australian Network, Annette Brownlie, and of course, the wonderful Marianne Hanson, the co-chair of ICAN Australia. So greetings to all of you, and thank you for being there in the flesh. I'm quite jealous. Let's first go to Jemila in Vienna for her summary of what's been happening, including how the meeting with the Australians went today, Jemila. What can you tell us?
Well, good evening, everyone, and good morning from Vienna. Lovely to see all of your faces on the screen, my beloved Brisbane community there. I'm just very excited that I'm supposed to be doing the update of how things are going in Vienna, but I think I'd like to maybe just pass that over to our special surprise guest, Susan Templeman MP, who's come all the way here to Vienna to observe the meeting on parties. So I feel like we'd all, we don't have heaps of time with her this morning, so I'll just pass over for her summary and her interpretation of how the event's been going so far.
Thank you. It is just delightful to not only be in Vienna, but to be able to speak with you all, and a big shout out to Terri Butler, who I know has had a passion for this issue for such a long time. It is really interesting being an observer here. And one of the things that I've noticed is that there isn't the recognition of Indigenous lands in the way that we recognise it. So I would really like to acknowledge the land that all of us are on has been had traditional owners, but particularly for those of you in Brisbane, and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and those who are with us today. I feel like yesterday was my chance just to get a feel for the lie of the land, listening to the opening statements. Today there will be statements from other observer nations, and I'm particularly keen not to miss those, which is why I'll stay with you as long as I can, but following the speakers list, I might have to leave before this event ends. There is a huge air of positivity around the progress and around the sense of purpose that people have. That's something I'm feeling. It was beautiful yesterday to hear Timor-Leste speak, having just signed the treaty. That was pretty exciting, yes. I thought. I also had a very quite short but useful meeting with Fiji Prime Minister Frank Bainimarama, and was able to acknowledge his contribution. What struck me is the presence of South Pacific, and I think that's a really important thing for Australia to be noting and recognising. I've obviously also had initial discussions with New Zealand with the Minister for Disarmament, Phil Twomey, and I'm looking forward to more of those. yesterday felt like an overview, a sense of where people are coming from, some commitments from people on the work that they'll do, including people like Samoa and the Cook Islands, talking about wanting to build momentum for this in our region. I think today there will be a lot more of the nitty-gritty about tackling some of the more complex issues related to it. So I'm looking forward to those discussions. But that's probably plenty from me. I feel very privileged to be here as the Australian observer, and I'm all ears open for how we can progress our engagement with this treaty.
Thank you so much, Susan.
It's truly
later on today.
Yes, that'll be great.
Yeah.
Great to see you, Susan. Thanks so much for joining us, and we're so thrilled that you're there. And I know the students from Kindle Hill, they sent me a picture and they were also really excited that you're there. So yeah, we look forward to seeing how the rest of the meeting unfolds, and to talking with you when you get back, and of course working with Labor to get this treaty signed and ratified.
I think we all have a common goal of getting rid of nuclear weapons, and let's work towards that.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for joining us at the Hub today. What a great surprise guest.
I'm going to listen for as long as I can till I get a text telling me I need to scoot.
All right, great. Well, now it's time for us to segue to our first, our second guest now, Ray Acheson. I'm wondering if we have another computer there, or if there is something we can do. Ray's going to come up.
Traditional musical chairs approach, actually.
Ray!
So just very thrilled to be here with our great friend Ray Acheson from Reaching Critical Will and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. You've also been watching closely the events over the past few days and have been compiling like a digest, a daily digest as part of Reaching Critical Will. What's your thoughts on how things are going so far?
Well, I'm really excited to be here. I'm excited to be with all of you. So thank you so much for having me. It's kind of amazing to be at this meeting, considering how much work went in to this treaty. And I've been thinking back to when there was just a few of us, scrapping along in basements and with no money. And it's just incredible that we made international law and got a bunch of states to agree to this. And now they're here and they're meeting and they're doing serious work. We mostly got stuck in the general exchange of views yesterday, so that's going to be continuing this morning. Unsurprisingly, it went over, as these things do. But I think that's also positive in a way, because all the countries that have shown up here have rejected nuclear weapons. And they delivered just really strong interventions that make it clear that they're determined to make this treaty meaningful in our world, and that they see it as the answer to the violence that we're engulfed in right now in terms of Ukraine, but also beyond that, with global military spending on the rise, climate change on the rise, global poverty and inequalities. And they really see the ban treaty as fitting into this larger landscape of our world, and see it as a tool that promotes dialogue, cooperation. Instead of weapons, it promotes words. So I think the positive spirit and energy at this meeting are unlike other UN meetings where you have the nuclear armed states coming in talking about how vital their weapons are and how they're instrumental to security. So there's none of that here. We will, of course, as Susan said, we'll have the statements from some of the other observer countries today. So they might have a slightly different tone, but I think also I'm hoping that they'll come with a sense of positivity, catch on to the vibe here a little bit, that they, if they're at this meeting, there's serious work to be done. We've also, of course, coming into this meeting, had 3 new ratifications for the treaty. So that was excellent to get to celebrate. And we know there's more on the way. And it's really just, bureaucratic logistical loopholes that prevented there not being more than 3 on the opening day. And so I think we'll have some new announcements coming forward in the days to come. And then I'm looking forward, I think, at this meeting to also, once they get into the work of the different articles on the treaties, to really see how a lot of that plays out. They've done so much work coming into this meeting already. The Austrians held an extensive series of consultations over the last year to develop the working papers, which are all available on the Reaching Critical Will website if you need to find those. And I think those are really good basis for the action plan that will hopefully be adopted here on the final day.
Ray, that's fantastic. It's so great to hear all of those updates. And thank you so much for everything in the Reaching Critical Will website. If people haven't seen it, I'll post a link in a minute. I mean, where have you been if you haven't been on Reaching Critical Will lately? But it's a remarkable resource for us all and really helps to keep us across. And the new ban monitor, the new Nuclear Ban Daily, has been a really wonderful read as well. It sort of gets you across things so quickly. So thank you for that. Ray, I have a million questions for you, but we're really calling for questions from the floor as well. I can't be greedy and keep you all to myself, but I did want to ask one quick question while I'm asking people to post anything that they would like to ask in the chat, which is that we're hearing a lot about complementarity with the NPT and the TPNW with the treaty. What can you tell us about that and how that is going to be played out? Because we're hearing a lot of questions around how those two things will work together.
Mm-hmm. So the state champions of the TPNW have always made it clear that they see this treaty as being a fulfillment of their own Article 6 obligations from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which commits states to pursue nuclear disarmament in good faith. So if you don't have nuclear weapons, how do you pursue nuclear disarmament? And so part of that was to develop international law prohibiting nuclear weapons, filling some of the legal gaps that existed within the Non-Proliferation Treaty that creates this hierarchy of states and just categorically outlaws nuclear weapons for everybody. And then also, of course, creates the positive obligations that the Non-Proliferation Treaty doesn't have anything on. And so the TPNW is, in that sense, an extension of the NPT obligations. It's always been seen that way. Of course, one of the arguments from some of the nuclear armed states or some of their allies has been that it undermines the NPT, but there's no sense in which the treaty actually does that, because it has stronger non-proliferation measures in that you can't share nuclear weapons, you can't, everything you couldn't do under the NPT is still illegal. And then there's added obligations that are made clear with this treaty. And then also in terms of, future verification of disarmament, well, all of that has to be set out anyway. So I always scratch my head when people say it undermines the NPT's verification structure. Like the NPT doesn't have a verification structure. The NPT, has its safeguards, obligations, but those are still continued very explicitly under the TPNW as well. So in that sense, also it just complements, reinforces the NPT.
Great, that's so fantastic. This is how I understood it as well. So it's good to hear you say it, because you say it so beautifully. Now look, another question that has come up is, how has gender been talked about in the meeting so far? Women, the role for women in disarmament is one of the points within the treaty, of course, and we know the importance of women's leadership in the disarmament movement more generally. How have we seen that being addressed within this meeting of states parties at the moment?
Yeah, a number of countries are reaffirming their commitment to the gender provisions of the TPNW, which includes, of course, that there's a disproportionate impact from ionizing radiation on the bodies of women and girls. So that's in the preamble of the treaty, but then also the call for states to increase women's participation. So it's very binary still in the treaty, as it is in a lot of things these days, but it is the first time that we've had either of these kinds of recognitions in international law on nuclear weapons. So it's groundbreaking in that regard. And a number of countries have spoken to the importance of these provisions at this meeting. Now, one thing, I do critique things in the name of feminist love. And I would say that the gendered representation at this meeting is abysmal. it has been overwhelmingly men taking the floor in this meeting. And that actually surprised me, because I thought that with these provisions in the treaties, countries would take seriously their concerns about representation. So I think that's definitely something that we can call out as I mean, there's still 2 days left of discussion, so maybe that will improve. Maybe it was just the high level opening debate. We know how the higher you go in a government system, often it's quite skewed. So I think that could even out, but at the end of this meeting, I think that it's something we can address with states to do better at the next meeting for sure.
Yes, it is surprising, isn't it? I was watching last night at the opening and thinking the same thing. There was a lot of male voices there, and blessed, but you know, that's not representative of how we've seen this develop in time, over the time with this treaty. Are there any questions from our friends in Meanjin?
Yes, we have the questioner over here. Hello, boards. I'll come forward. Hello, my name's Leah, and you're talking about representation of women. I'm also interested, g'day Ross, I'm particularly interested when I look at the age range of the people here in the Red Cross. Just interested to know if other states and other places, other meeting venues, if young people are well represented. I happen to be on the older end of that scale, so.
Yeah, here in Vienna, there are heaps of young people. I don't even know most of the people that came to the Nuclear Ban Forum on the weekend, honestly. They're young, they're vibrant, they're engaged, they're ready to go. It's really been amazing to see, especially I think after being trapped indoors for 2.5 years. Yes, it's incredible that, like, where did all these young people come from that suddenly care about nuclear weapons? But I think it's because of all the work that ICAN has done over the years to really try and engage a younger generation. And so they are here at this meeting of states parties. They are doing advocacy with governments. They are helping us with note taking. They are participating in the side events. They're organizing different things. So that's been just wonderful to see.
That's great. Thank you. Ray, I've just got, there's so many people asking questions in the chat here to me. I've just got 2 more for you. I know you need to get back to the meeting because it's a big day. One person who's here from the Red Cross is asking, I have a follow-up question on compatibility between NPT and TPNW. What are the thoughts around some states' views that TPNW provides opportunities to forum shop between the NPT and the TPNW safeguard measures for states that are yet party to either treaty?
I don't
actually, sorry, Ray, just before you go, I will just throw the other one in here as well. Have the talks been positive with South Pacific nations as well? Yeah, throwing both things at you at once.
Okay. So yes, I don't see a risk with forum shopping. You know, almost all countries in the world are party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's only India, Pakistan, Israel, and DPRK that are not. I don't think any of them are going to join the TPNW as an expectation that that would somehow let them off the hook for safeguards. I think quite the contrary. We would love to have them in the TPNW, of course, but then they would be committing to complete nuclear disarmament. And under a verified system to be agreed as nuclear armed states join the treaty. So I don't see that as a risk at all. There's zero talk or appetite for countries that have joined the TPNW to leave the NPT. I mean, of course, there's a lot of frustration and anger within the NPT regime. We had Egypt walking out a few years ago from a meeting, and you know, the frustration there with failed review conferences or failure to commit to fulfill the commitments to disarmament or on the Middle East certainly come up, but there's never been even hints of folks leaving the NPT for the TPNW, and I would be astonished if that happened. But yeah, so I think that is we will continue apace and see what happens at the NPT RevCom. We'll also be there, Reaching Critical Will will also be there with doing our reporting, but I think we'll be in less good spirits at that meeting. If you talk to us, we'll be like a little bit lower energy and ripping our hair out a little bit. But we'll definitely be there and advocating for the best possible outcomes, of course. And then on the South Pacific, yeah, I mean, the Pacific engagement, I think Susan was also talking about this, just really incredible to see so many countries from the Pacific here taking things seriously. They've been engaged with the consultations, feeding into the working papers and then the action plan. Really strong statements from many of them yesterday, and I'm sure that will continue throughout the week as well. Really seeing this as, you know, something that, while not a perfect instrument, is still the first time that it's really been acknowledged what has been done to the Pacific by the nuclear armed states, and that there is, you know, redress for this, and that we are taking justice into account within this treaty regime, which is very unique. And so it's great that representatives of these countries also see that, recognize that, and are engaging with the treaty on that basis.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ray. Thank you for joining us today. It's always so good to have you, you know, feeding into our feeds and also just giving us the background and the information that we all need to keep across all that is going on internationally. Thanks so much, our dear friend.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Ray.
Switch.
Yeah, we'll just switch it.
Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, so great to have Ray here and yeah, have those resources to look back over. With so much going on, it's just wonderful that there are people from all over the world capturing all the different facets of what's going on. And someone else who's been really instrumental in capturing some of the voices and things coming out of the last few days, and particularly the voices of Hibakusha and survivor communities in Japan, is Rico Ishii Robertson. So very happy to introduce her to you today. She's from Peace Boat, and also, as Dimity mentioned before, has a history of organising with us in Australia, mainly in the West. So really wonderful to have you. And I just wanted to start with asking, what has been, what's been most of interest to you from a Japanese civil society perspective?
Thank you, Jemila. And hi, everybody back in Australia. I really am happy to be here. Before I answer that question, I have to add one more thing, that as if it's not enough, I am together with Dimity and Templeman from ICAN Australia. I am Peace Boat is a part of a new initiative called Nuclear Truth Project, which is focusing on the sensitivity and properly manners to approach to the community affected peoples. Because again, how you are always telling us there's nothing about us without us. So Nuclear Truth Project is taking it very seriously and put it in words in a proper document so everybody can share and learn and adapt it in practice. So that's one of the last thing I wanted to add about what I am representing here. So thank you for the question. So it's incredible because to see how much movement and actions coming out from Japan, as I have been out of the country for the last 10 years. I have been hearing how it is going on and moving forward as in text and videos, but meeting and in person and having an off-the-record conversation is really valuable, and I'm learning so much very quickly. Yesterday, there was a youth MSP, and one of the Hibakusha had a testimonies in front of about 100 youth advocates coming from all over the world and learning from each other. And after that, we had a little workshop that was coordinated by the youth delegates from Japan. And I've been talking to other colleagues how the Japanese youth has changed because traditionally Japanese people are rather shy and feel a little uncomfortable speaking in English when we can't speak perfect English. but I don't see it anywhere at all in their actions. They just go and talk to people in whatever level of language that they have. It's more like I'm here representing people, and I have an important message to pass to you. So please, can we have a conversation? So that courage and that commitment in youth, it's really inspiring to see, and it is kind of also inspiring the old Hibakshes who's getting really old and kind of their health condition, their physical strength has been decaying. So I think I'm seeing that the youth presence here and back home is really giving them hope. And again, as Auntie Sue put it in a beautiful word in Civil Society Forum, our hope and stories is stronger than your weapons and grief. And I really, really agree with that. And I think I'm seeing that back in Japan and here as well. And continuing, following that, we had the parliamentarians for TPNW. There were 4 Japanese parliamentarians joined as a part of it, and they were really committed to be taken as a role in that discussion. So without our presence of the government, it was still I did see hope in there. Another action that I saw yesterday was the Mayors for Peace, led by 2 mayors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the mayor Matsui Kazui, yesterday he said they are hosting a G7 summit next year, and then he was very encouraging all the participants to the summit to learn from learn about the impact that was brought by the nuclear weapons to the Hibakshis in Japan. So it's a rather quick recap of yesterday about the Japanese delegation and their actions.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much for that recap, and great to meet you, Rico. Wonderful that you're there. So we're so sorry, obviously, that the Japanese government decided not to attend formally. That's must be so disappointing for so many people. But we're working very hard to get Australia on board the treaty, and we're so pleased that the formal delegation is there. How do you think, when Australia does sign and ratify, how do you think that might affect your work in Japan?
Oh, it's going to have a huge positive impact on our government for sure, because we are connected with one ocean. You are on the other end of the ocean, and we say that because we walk on the boat, and then that goes around the water, right? So we do know that it's connected, and because our government is not courageous enough as your new government. So I really appreciate the presence of Susan, because the ruling government of Australia has taken a huge step forward to send a delegation here. Send her here. And I think that will kind of give us a showcase that even under a huge impact of the nuclear weapon states politically, we can still do that. Our government can still do that. What's lacking here is the will and commitment, and that is a very shameful behavior. And together with our presence of the youth and young activists and Hibakshis, and our media is huge here. There are like 10 Japanese media here covering how much wider the nuclear affected peoples are from, and how much more they're out there rather than Hibaksha. So, and how shameful it is, unlike your government, that they're not even here to learn. Susan said that she's here to learn and she's open for dialogue, and that's what we want. So I think if Australian government does step forward and send sign and ratify TPNW, it's definitely going to have a positive impact, which we, the Japanese civil society groups, really, really looking forward to see. So, Australia.
We'll work very hard at that. And I think I'd like to call if there are any questions from the room in Meanjin. I think we just have time for one quick question so we can let you get back to the conference, Rico. Is there any anyone in the room there who would like to ask something?
Yes, Annette.
Just a question I had for Ray earlier on, really, that others at the conference might be able to answer, is just how the impact of the war in Ukraine, the threat of nuclear war as a result of that war, what sort of impact has it had on people attending in Vienna?
Oh, thank you for the question. It's been because this conference is taking place in Europe, where the threat and fear of the next nuclear war is so realistic. It's been often mentioned by the events, and I think that although it's very scary that people are taking this TPNW's importance and necessity more seriously because of the in-face threat of the nuclear war. And I just wanted to make it very quick, but I wanted to say that because you have Aboriginal community, because you have the impacted peoples by the other nuclear industry, nuclear weapon industry. Pacific Youth from Majuro, she said, it feels like when you're talking about the possibility and threat of upcoming nuclear war, they feel like they're left behind. And I think it's really important to note that, where European delegates are so focused on the incoming threat of nuclear war, there are people who survived, and there are people who's been fighting about this. So I think it's very important to get that voice forward and then push the Article 6 and 7 right here in the discussion room, so they actually feel that it's not just a threat. It has actually happened in the past, and it's still ongoing. The impact is ongoing. So if we can put the dialogue into that discussion table, I think it's going to be very effective. And we've got really strong voices here from the South Pacific and also ICAN Australia, represented by Jemila. So yeah, that's what we are hoping to see, to hear in the conversation.
Fantastic, thank you. Is there anything else from the room there in Meanjin? Any other questions? If not, then I do believe Dimity has one. Before then, we will let you go.
Well, sorry, my internet is being very difficult at the moment. So I hope you can hear me. I might just turn off my video. I hope you can hear me. Rico, thank you so much for your explanation. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how the voices of Hibakusha have been incorporated into the events there in Vienna. And I particularly wanted to thank you for mentioning the protocols with the Nuclear Truth Project as well. But how have the Hibakusha been represented in Vienna there this week?
It's surprising that so many Hibakushas flew such a long distance in such scary moment in pandemic. They brought themselves over here, and they have been welcomed and represented at the Civil Society Forum and the Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons Forum, but then not much on the first meeting of said parties. And we're getting a lot of questions from Japanese media why the representative of the nuclear impact affected peoples are from Kazakhstan and not Hibakusha. The answer is very simple. Our government is not present, and Kazakh government has taken initiative. So it's such an embarrassing thing, and it's such a disappointing thing for aging Hibakusha people. And they are used to being disappointed by our government, but this is such a final blow for them, because they have been waiting for our government to say, we come, at least we are observing this, but that didn't even happen. So they're excellent in keeping up their hopes and being kind and being open to dialogues and interviews from medias from all over the world, but you can't hide their disappointment, and there's a very clear reason why.
Thank you, Rico. I'm sorry that my internet is so bad. I keep turning my camera off, but I think that's a very good explanation. We feel a little the same from here, that we weren't able to have people speaking directly from affected communities other than via broadcast, which was a wonderful opportunity. But it is sad not to have a big delegation in Vienna at the moment. We hope that we'll be able to do more next time.
Sure, but this MS meeting of state parties, we don't see any Aboriginal people here, but I had to say, Annie, Sue, Karina, and Mia, and then everybody who was behind them, thank you so much for having such a strong presence at the Civil Society Forum. We don't have you here in person, but because you made such a wonderful presence there, that kind of set the tone of the civil society side, and that we brought your heart and your voices into this room. So even we don't have you here, you are with us. So yes, I just wanted to say that as a part of the civil society who's fighting hard from within.
We're very grateful.
Thank you so much. We'll make sure that we pass that on.
Thank you.
And yeah, we're very grateful to Rico and Mary and others and all of Peace Vote for incorporating some of the comments and calls to action that came out of the World Nuclear Survivors Forum, and also testimonies from the event that we co-hosted over the weekend from First Nations communities in Australia, that will be included in a civil society statement that will be presented to delegates later in the sessions, hopefully today. So we'll keep an eye out for that and be able to share that on as well. But yeah, it's a real indication of the I guess the solidarity and ongoing community that is existing between civil society, particularly around impacted communities and countries where there is still so much more to be done to address the harms of atomic bombings and testing across the world. So that has been a very heartening thing to experience as someone who's come to this meeting for the first time, to see that in motion, and from the Civil Society Forum right through to the diplomatic meetings and the delegations and the many incredible opening remarks that we heard yesterday. I think particularly powerful, and I feel very glad that Australia has been in the room to hear and absorb and really, like as Ray mentioned earlier on, get a sense that we are here to work and there are serious things to consider, and there has been a lot that has brought us to this point in the negotiations of the treaty and all of the work that's happened in between entry into force and now. So, and I think that has been really great for everyone to experience and be part of.
Thank you so much, Rico. Really wonderful to be with you, and we'll be looking forward to the next meeting of States Parties 2024, in which case we're hoping to have Japan present and Australia maybe even signed up and on the way to ratification by then. So we look forward to continuing this journey alongside you. Thank you.
See you in 2 years, if not earlier.
And can I just check, Jemila, if our third guest has arrived there in the room? Because
just having a look outside to make sure that they're not lost in the hallways, but not as yet. So it could be that there is a particularly compelling moment inside, and we have had a few issues with accessing the building, just because there are so many people here, and the UN has a very sort of security protocols that everyone has to go through. So it's possible that they have just been delayed in this Benedict might have been delayed in this instance. I can't see a message from him, unfortunately, but
that's okay, because perhaps we can go to our room in Meanjin, and then we may have a couple of minutes at the end if Benedict makes it into the room to turn to him. So are we ready in the room, Brisbane, to move a little earlier up in the agenda? I'd love to hand over to you in person there.
Happy to do that now then. Or did other people have questions that they wanted to put to either Jem or Jemila or the speakers? Wendy Flannery.
Yes, I just was going to ask Jemila, is there any indication that any of the NATO countries are going to sign the treaty?
We haven't had any indications like that at this point in time, but it is very heartening to have them here as observers. So some other countries, when Australia announced that they were observing, there was also Belgium and the Netherlands also were kind of latecomers to the party and have decided to attend this meeting. So that's very heartening, and we hope that they're having a really illuminating experience here with the atmosphere and the commitment of the states parties to bringing this forward. Yes, I'm also interested to hear what is happening in their opening remarks, but I think it's also, important to note that, they aren't party to the treaty, so they can make whichever comments they would like, but it will be the states parties to the treaty that are gathered here today that will be determining the narrative for the rest of the sessions going forward around addressing the things that we're here to talk about. So those Articles 6 and 7, which are looking at pathways for environmental remediation, victims assistance, and sort of implementing kind of roadmaps and pathways for that, and sort of the action plan. So, this will also be important for them to listen to. So there will be, no doubt, very interesting conversations and dialogues that will continue. But I have also heard the president of the event, which is Ambassador Alexander Clement. He has spoken to the NATO states in the same sort of position that NATO membership doesn't exclude people from joining the TPNW. He's made that explicitly clear on a number of occasions. So I think that will also be a good take-home message for those states as well.
I might just jump in and say a little bit more about the NATO issue, if I may. There is a lot of support for Germany to sign up to the treaty, for Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium. So I think those governments are very, very sensitive to the fact that their population really wants those states to sign this new treaty. And that explains why they are there as observers. It's a terrific thing. And as Jemila said, there is nothing at all that would prevent a NATO state from joining the new treaty. They would simply have to make sure and declare publicly that they are not going to be part of any nuclear planning and that they don't consider themselves to be under a nuclear weapons umbrella. Conventional weapons are plenty destructive enough. We don't need the nukes. Have another question, Annette?
Just to you, Marianne. If the European states, for example, Germany or Poland, that actually have American arms and nuclear weapons on their territory, if they sign up, what happens in relation to that?
No state which signs up to the TPNW will be permitted to assist in any kind of nuclear weapons activities, and that means having them on their soil. So they would need to go. And that's fine. They've gone from plenty of other countries in Europe. So yes, it can be done. And at the moment, that would apply to Germany and the Netherlands in particular, where there still are US nuclear weapons present on the soil. Okay.
We've just heard, Marianne, that Benetic has been caught up in security. So apologies for that delay. That's outside of our control. But maybe we could hear a little bit about what you're doing there tonight in that hub in Meanjin. And you could catch us up with that, and maybe we'll still have a few minutes to talk to Benetic when he gets through.
Yes, I'll be happy to do that. I'm really proud to be here, not just as someone who's been involved in campaigning for nuclear disarmament for over 40 years, actually close to 50 now, but also to be, I've just turned 65, so I've been around for quite a while. But also I'm really proud to be the co-chair of ICAN Australia. And, you know, we owe the ICAN people such a lot, people who kicked this organization off in 2007 in Melbourne, right? And subsequently, of course, ICAN has grown to be an international organization, and it's gone from strength to strength. And of course, thanks to the efforts that ICAN put towards making people aware of the dangers of nuclear weapons and the efforts to secure the UN treaty, of course, ICAN was awarded the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. And I'm delighted, Alfie, as we call him, short for Alfred Nobel, with me today. I picked him up from Pack and Send 10 minutes to 5. He's doing the rounds at the moment around Australia. But so, you know, this is very much something that is close to the heart of people who've been involved in ICAN, but also WILP women, IPAN, faith-based groups, so many organizations, grassroots organizations. And I want to thank you all for supporting this campaign. So we are at a critical point, I think, at the moment. We've got a new government. We know that Albanese has expressed strong support for the treaty, and we are hoping that it won't be too long before the government will sign this treaty. In fact, Labor has made a formal commitment that it will do so. What happens in the regions is very important as well. So, I mean, this is one reason why we are hosting these hubs around Australia for this week. It's to connect with people on the ground here and to send that message right through to our local governments, our state governments, and our federal governments, that there is support for Australia to sign the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. We can stay, if we wish, within the ANZUS alliance. Now, there might be some who would say, well, you know, maybe that's not such a good idea anyway, but whatever the case, if Australia chose to remain within the ANZUS alliance, there is nothing that prevents us from signing the TPNW. There would have to be some sort of removal of certain facilities in Pine Gap and elsewhere, and we would have to declare that we are quite willing to stay as an ally of the United States, but on the basis of a conventional weapons alliance. In other words, that we don't believe that our security is something that can be achieved via the threat to incinerate millions of innocent people. So that's a little bit about ICAN and what is happening sort of throughout Australia and at these hubs. I'd like to invite now our WILP representative, Valerie Joy, to say something about WILP's involvement and how the rest of the evening will be run.
Thank you, Marianne. First, I'd like to acknowledge that we have loved working with Jemila. And about 3 years ago, she pointed out to us that no Queensland council had given support to the TPNW. And so we engaged in a campaign, all of us, writing letters, phone calls, trying to make appointments, and we got absolutely nowhere. So a couple of us went into far western Queensland to speak with the councils there. They're closer to Pine Gap, to Darwin, and possible targets, and also had been irradiated by the nuclear testing at Woomera and Maralinga. We had 3 appointments only because some councils weren't happy to talk to us. And of those, the most wonderful was Mount Isa. And I'd like to give acknowledgement to Chris Henderson and Vicky Yen, who is here tonight, because they laid the way for us. So it's always a team effort. So when we got there, we were interviewed by the editor of the Northwest Times. We had an interview on ABC Breakfast Radio. And then by that stage, we got up to the council and we had a very good hearing. And they recommended, or the mayor, that we do a presentation, a 15-minute presentation to the council, following which they were the first council in Queensland, a mining city, a city that had, benefited from uranium, and they became our first council. So I'm going to hand over to Marianne to tell you the rest of the story, because it's changing.
Yes, indeed. Indeed it is. Mount Isa has the honour of being the very first Queensland local government area to have signed up. And I had made the promise that the first LGA within Queensland to sign up in support of what we call the Cities Appeal would get a visit from Alfie. Now, I thought that would be maybe Ipswich or Brisbane or Gold Coast. Lo and behold, it was our wonderful friends in Mount Isa. So it was quite a trek, but it was worth it. And again, I'd like to thank all our wonderful supporters in Mount Isa. They did sign, and it was a historic moment. It was quite a celebration in the town, actually, because it's not often that the Nobel Peace Prize comes to Mount Isa, one would say. Now, having said that, Brisbane has been a very, very hard nut to crack. It's a LNP-dominated council, and even though we have asked them for years, can they please sign on to the Cities Appeal, we kept getting fobbed off, right? Emails from the mayor saying, no, can't do that, we can't do that. Well, we don't take no for an answer. So we engaged in a program of individual visits to councillors. We wrote emails and letters, and I know many of you helped out in that. And WILP representatives and I made a presentation to Brisbane City Council on the 31st of May, and they have agreed to sign. And that is really wonderful news. So Brisbane City Council will be in due course signing on, and they will join Melbourne, Canberra, Sydney, Paris, Berlin, New York, hundreds of cities around the world. But our work isn't over, because we are now focusing on Ipswich City Council, Gold Coast Council, and then further and further afield. So yes, there is a lot of work to be done, but it's been a wonderful ride. And I was privileged enough to go with Dell and with Joy to Valerie, sorry, to Mount Isa. That was really a very, very special trip that we made with Alfie. Going through airport security with him was an interesting exercise as well. because of course I had to, you know, when I was asked, well, what is that metal thing? I have to show it. And I said, well, okay, you can see it. What is it? It's the Nobel Peace Prize. No. Yes, it is. Come on over and have a look, everybody. So we've had a number of security people in Brisbane Airport coming over to take a look at our thing. So there are some very high points in this journey, and that is one of them. How are we doing for time now?
Thank you, Marianne. We actually we have not heard yet back from Benedict, so we're going to have to let that go, which is a very unfortunate, because he's been doing amazing work over there in Vienna, along with the Marshallese Education Initiative. So we're going to say our farewells from the online part of this, though of course, as Jem has put in the chat, for those people who wish to stay on, we're going to leave this Zoom open so anyone can watch the Brisbane panel as well, because I know that you've got much more to share there.
Before you go, I'd love it if you could all remain online for a very important event that we have planned now, and that is to invite the new member, federal member for the seat of Ryan, Elizabeth Watson-Brown from the Green Party, who is taking the parliamentary pledge to support the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and who has kindly agreed to join us for this evening. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Someone else has just popped out. Yes, I've been loving hearing the stories of the travels of Alfie. And it's a huge honour to be standing beside Alfie tonight and with you amazing people who've been doing such incredible work. Yeah, and I'm very proud to be representing the Greens tonight, and very proud to be saying the pledge tonight. Thank you. Because a very important pillar of the Greens party is, as you all would know, peace and disarmament. So it's absolutely central to the way we see the future. And it's lovely to hear about the progress that's being made. And I think we all in the room are feeling, and I've been saying to my neighbour there is a real sense of change and optimism in the air. And I think that's demonstrated by the stories you've been telling, and the lovely story about Mount Isa. And I do think that there is real change in the air and real progress around all of the changes we need for the future for all of us. So I'm very happy to read the pledge. Thank you. I, the undersigned parliamentarian, warmly welcome the adoption of the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons on the 7th of July 2017 as a significant step towards the realisation of a nuclear weapon-free world. I share the deep concern expressed in the preamble about the catastrophic humanitarian consequences that would result from any use of nuclear weapons, and we recognise, and I recognise, the consequent need to eliminate these inhumane and abhorrent weapons. As a parliamentarian, I pledge to work for the signature and ratification of this landmark treaty by our respective countries, as we consider the abolition of nuclear weapons to be a global public good of the highest order and an essential step to promote the security and well-being of all peoples.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much.
And welcome to the community of those who have signed the pledge.
And look forward to this new parliament.
We have other parliamentarians who have also
Terri,
signed
good on
the
you.
pledge.
Respect. Yes. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That's really wonderful. And of course, Terri Butler in the room is also a signatory to the Parliamentary Pledge. And tonight, Elizabeth's signature brings it to 101 federal parliamentarians in the new parliament that have taken that pledge. So that's a really significant number, and that's wonderful. So I think it is time for us to wrap up this online session so that you can continue into the in-person session there in Brisbane. And I'll thank so much Jemila there in Vienna for being our anchor as ever, bringing us the latest news and convincing our wonderful representative Susan Templeman to join us. And for Rico, Ishii, Robertson, you are there. And there's Mary as well from Peace Boat. Wonderful to see you. The Peace Boat team are extraordinary. And if you have not heard of it, the World Nuclear Survivors Forum, which was organised by Peace Boat in December last year, was a really significant event that heard from people impacted by nuclear weapons use and testing around the world. And they have made a beautiful report from that event they've taken to Vienna, and it's also available online. So maybe we can dig that up and share it to you all later. And also they've gone now, but Ray Acheson was at the top of our speaking list today. So that was wonderful to hear from Ray. Jemila, please pass on our sincere thanks to them when you see them during the conference. And this is the third and almost final nuclear ban hub. The last one will be in Melbourne, where the campaign began on Friday, and will be here on this exact same link online for 1 hour from 6 o'clock p.m, 4 o'clock in the west, and 6:30 p.m. in the centre. And if you're registered for the hubs, then you'll get the notification for that. And if you're online and in Melbourne, please do head along in person if you can, because it will be a great evening. And we'll be hearing then about the second and the final day of the meeting of states parties, because that will be a really significant time to then see any outcome documents, to see what the tone was, what decisions were made, and what the next steps are for universalisation of the treaty, and of course what our Australian government will do next, and how we'll respond to this and carry it forward. So, is there anything else that you'd like to add, my dear co-host Dimity?
Well, not really, except to say thank you so much to all of those guests, as you mentioned, but also to all the wonderful people in the room up there in Meanjin, and to hear that pledge read out for the first time. I haven't heard someone read it out before. I've read it 100 times, but to hear that was just really special. So 101 parliamentarians behind the treaty now here in this country. It sounds like we're getting enough people to really get that momentum to sign and ratify. So thank you so much for that. And just the only other thing I would say, I'm going to pop them into the chat, is there were two beautiful articles this week. Guardian Australia had an article which were looking at Australia attending the Vienna conference, and also in the ABC there was a beautiful report from our Port Augusta hub, and it's really worth having a look at those if you haven't seen them already. So thank you to all our friends in Meanjin. Thank you to our Jemila and all our friends over in Vienna. We're loving hearing all your stories from over there as well. And we'll see you next on Friday, I hope.
Thanks, Dimity. Thanks, Jen. We will take a very, very brief break, just to stretch your legs, get some food, but we are running a little bit over time, so 5 minutes maximum, and then we come back for what promises to be an excellent panel discussion with our very special guests. So no more than 5 minutes. Thanks. Nice smile. Perfect. Thank you. Yes, Rotary is definitely absolutely. Yes, please. I'm happy to. Very happy to. I mean, I've spoken to many individuals. It's always a pleasure. So just send me an email or something. All right. Okay. Welcome back, everybody. We now commence the in-person activities here, and we have a panel of distinguished speakers addressing us tonight on the issues of peace, disarmament, the impacts that military spending can have on the environment, the destructive effects that it can have on the environment, etc. So without further ado, let me kick off. I know that we're running a little bit over time. I do want to welcome those of you who are online. It's terrific to have you here with us in spirit and in a virtual way. Okay, so please let me introduce to the chair, first of all, Professor Ian Lowe. Now, many of you will know Ian from his extensive work and his writings, particularly on environmental issues. Ian also has a reasonably new book, which was addressing things nuclear. There it is. Yep. So without further ado, I'll invite Ian to speak for 6 minutes. Thank you.
I'd also like to acknowledge that we're on the land of the Turrbal and the Jagera people, recognise that sovereignty is never ceded, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and say how delighted I am that we finally have a government of grown-ups who are going to adopt the modest and reasonable demands of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. A virtual link-up of Australian experts earlier this year identified two existential threats to human civilization: climate change and nuclear weapons. And again, we finally have a government taking timid steps towards doing something about the first of those. And I want to acknowledge the next speaker's wonderful work as Shadow Minister in getting the ALP into that position. But we still have a complete failure of decision makers in Australia to recognise the issue of nuclear weapons and the environmental threats of the nuclear industry, which is what I've been asked to say a few words about tonight. It isn't just nuclear weapons. There are other aspects of the nuclear industry that we should be concerned about on environmental grounds. For example, during the first Gulf War in 1991, the US bombed Iraq with 340 tons of missiles containing depleted uranium, which poisoned the soil and water of Iraq. Every nuclear power station, and there are over 400 of them, produces radioactive waste that has to be managed for geological time. And nowhere is there an operational program to manage that waste. And I remind you, it's not just a technical problem, isolating waste for tens of thousands of years. It's also a significant social problem, because that's a period far longer than any human civilization has ever endured. So to be producing radioactive waste with a clear conscience, we would need to be confident we had not just technical solutions, but also social structures that will ensure that that waste is not a risk for future generations. In fact, we should recognise that the nuclear power industry, its genesis was a public relations stunt to distract attention from the production of fissile material for weapons. When the young Queen Elizabeth II turned a switch and distributed electricity from Calder Hall to a small number of houses, the whole purpose of that exercise was to distract attention of the British taxpayer from the fact that the whole purpose of building Calder Hall was to produce plutonium for the British bomb. And the entire nuclear power industry is basically a public relations stunt to distract attention from the fact that the whole purpose of nuclear reactors, as they were set up first in the US, then in the UK, then in France, then in China, then in Russia, was to produce fissile material for weapons. We should also recognise that having nuclear facilities is an environmental risk, even without nuclear weapons being used. We've seen that demonstrated when Russian forces were briefly in charge of Chernobyl. And there's a real concern not for malice, but for misadventure. When military people with no nuclear expertise at all are in charge of nuclear facilities temporarily, things can go badly wrong. And of course, Chernobyl, along with Fukushima, is a dramatic example that with peaceful civil nuclear power, things can go badly wrong and render whole regions uninhabitable. I also remind people that building nuclear facilities like nuclear reactors essentially presupposes eternal peace, because whenever there has been a shooting war, facilities like power stations and dams have been seen as legitimate targets. And an attack with even conventional explosives on a nuclear power station would have horrific environmental consequences. Of course, the ultimate stupidity is putting nuclear reactors somewhere where you know people will try to destroy them. Why do nuclear submarines come to mind? And the dopey last-minute decision of the failing Morrison government to reject the plan to build French submarines and try to get American or British nuclear submarines. Just to make the obvious point, if there were ever a war between parties that had nuclear submarines, opponents would be trying to destroy those submarines, and the radiological consequences of the destruction of a nuclear reactor underwater are just horrific. Finally, there is, of course, the issue of nuclear weapons. At the peak of the Cold War, there was something like 70,000 nuclear weapons around the world. That's been reined back, and there's now only 13,000, of which about 1,900 are on a high alert, meaning they're ready for almost immediate use. Russia and the US each have about 6,000 nuclear weapons. China has about 350. France and the UK have about 200 each. India and Pakistan have about 160 each. Israel has 80 or 90. And North Korea apparently has enough fissile material for about 40 weapons. Now, to put that in context, it's been shown that even a modest nuclear war involving 30 or 40 weapons would produce so much debris that we would have a nuclear winter. Temperatures would plummet by about 10 degrees. The amount of solar radiation coming in for plants would be reduced by 90%, and it would effectively mean the end of civilization. And that's a consequence of the fact that while the nuclear weapons that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki were appalling, modern nuclear weapons are typically between 10 and 100 times as powerful as those which destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Marianne made the point that holding nuclear weapons is essentially terrorism on an industrial scale. We are rightly appalled when one deranged individual holds 10 individuals hostage and threatens to kill them if their demands are not met. And the Lindt Cafe siege was an appalling situation. But if you think about what holding nuclear weapons means, it is a threat to kill millions of innocent civilians if the demands of the country holding them are not met. And the US new statement on nuclear weapons under George W. Bush said that the US regards that it's entirely reasonable for them to use nuclear weapons even against countries that aren't nuclear armed if they cannot achieve their political aims by normal military means. And that is basically a threat to commit mass murder on a scale that the world has never seen, simply to pursue a political agenda. And that's why this cause is so important. It's really critical for the future of civilization that we rid the world of nuclear weapons. Because the one thing we know about arms races is that they nearly always end up with the arms being used. If the weapons exist, sooner or later, a leader will be sufficiently deranged or sufficiently desperate to use them. For the future of civilization, we have to push ahead. We have to work for Australia to become a signatory to this treaty, and we have to work to put pressure on the weapons holding states so that they see that it is morally unacceptable to continue to hold nuclear weapons. So we must push for the signing of the treaty, the ratifying of the treaty, and ridding the world once and for all of the appalling threat of nuclear weapons. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you very much, Ian. That was absolutely fantastic. It brought together so many interconnected issues here. We can't just see nuclear weapons in terms of strategic studies. These have an impact on ideas about militarism, on excessive spending, impacts on the environment, impacts on First Nations people, and then the ethics and the morality of it. So thank you for drawing attention to all those very, very important points. Okay, our second speaker, and I'm delighted to welcome her here again, and she has attended a number of ICAN and WILF-related events. Terri Butler is the former Labor member for the seat of Griffith, and she served admirably well in that role. She's been a strong advocate of human rights and was very important in driving the marriage equality issue. But of course, closest to my own heart, she is a strong supporter of the need to eliminate nuclear weapons. She is someone who also has signed the parliamentary pledge. So how privileged are we to have two parliamentarian signers here? Please welcome to the floor, Terri Butler.
Well, thanks, Marianne, and thanks everyone for being here tonight on such an important occasion. I want to join with the other speakers in acknowledging traditional owners of the land that we gather on tonight and paying my respects to elders past and present. And it was a particular pleasure to be here with Auntie Deb Sandy. She and I, of course, both spoke at the 2017 rally right here in Queensland to support the creation and establishment of the treaty as part of our participation in WILF and in ICAN, excuse me, in ICAN. So it was a real joy to be back, getting the band back together, I guess, to really celebrate tonight. I mean, what a terrific achievement. Who would have thought in 2017 that in 2022 we'd be here acknowledging the first meeting of the states parties to the treaty? What a wonderful achievement. And it's a testament to grassroots but international organising. It's a testament to all of you and to every member of the organisations that have been behind this important work. I wanted to say, one of the reasons I wanted to come tonight was to say thank you to all of you for the work that you have done. And just to emphasise, I think the real significance of grassroots movements in influencing not just domestic policy, but international law. As I think Ray said before, making international law, might have been Jemila, is such an incredible achievement. And it's of course recognised through the Nobel Peace Prize, through ALFI, but it's recognised the greatest, of course, monument and testament to the effectiveness of the work is the fact that the treaty exists and that more and more states parties are signing on. And of course, we saw 3 new states parties, I think only yesterday. So it's a really great testament. Of course, there's so much to be done, so much more to be done. But I wanted to mention to you the role that your grassroots organising has played in my life and in influencing my willingness to be an advocate for the treaty, to be an advocate for disarmament and anti-nuclear causes. And Annette Brownlie knows this, but in my early 20s, I went to the first big event that Just Peace held at Town Hall. And I was radicalised into the peace movement by Just Peace and Annette Brownlie. She knows this because I told the story at Normborn's 60th wedding anniversary quite recently, another founder of Just Peace in Queensland. But hearing the stories, the real stories of people who participated who've seen firsthand the impact of weapons, of militarisation and of conflict is important, I think. We need to keep telling these stories, and that's why grassroots organising is really important. And similarly, I think it's important to make sure that we continue to educate people. You heard from our people who are crossing from Vienna about the fact that there are so many young people at Vienna. I think we do need to remember the importance of value of continuing to talk about the threat of nuclear weapons. I think sometimes people, because there are so many other threats, people are overwhelmed by that. And so they put nuclear weapons kind of to the back of their mind as a threat. And people of my parents' generation and people of my generation are, I guess, old enough to have lived with this clear and present threat, whereas people of my children's generation, I think it's just not as much at the forefront of their discussions. And part of our education also has to be about educating people who hold public office. It is so important that we do continue to put into the forefront of their minds this really significant international issue. The work that ICAN has done, the work that WILP has done, the work that Just Peace has done, coming to see politicians of all levels. I loved that story about Mount Isa earlier. Just beautiful, Marianne. It's so wonderful. And Valerie, amazing to get Mount Isa to be the first council to sign up in Queensland is terrific. But educating people of all levels who are holding public office. And particularly true, I think that's particularly true for people from parties of government, because of course it's governments that make decisions, it's administrations that make decisions, it's governments that sign treaties and ensure the ratification of treaties through Parliament. I had the real benefit of joining an APEC delegation and actually leading that delegation to Japan when I first started as a parliamentarian, and we visited Nagasaki and we visited the epicenter of where the bomb was dropped. We visited the location where Australians were being held at the time, and we visited the museum. I know many of you will have visited museums in either Nagasaki or Hiroshima, and you will never forget. That will always stay with you. And so to me, those visits, the visits to locations where people have been directly affected, are important in influencing the outcomes of politics, of public life. So I think it's really important that we continue to press for education. So the work that you do in lobbying, in meeting with politicians of all levels is important. I encourage you to do that, particularly with parties of government, but also making sure that we do send those people to those locations to understand, not understand fully, of course, but to at least be influenced by the facts and the history. In terms of the current government, I have to say it was a great relief, wasn't it? To see the removal of the Morrison-Joyce government and the election of an Albanese Labor government. And people probably would expect that on election night, we didn't know whether we were going to win the seat of Griffith for Labor, but I was dancing up there on our stage after my speech, because to me, the main issue is we finally have a government that will take real action on all sorts of issues, on climate change, of course, but on these international relations issues that are so important to us, so important to the peace movement, so important to the labour movement, so important to the women's movement. These things really matter, and it matters who's in charge. It matters who the Prime Minister is. And I don't speak for that government. I'm not a member of it. I'm not in the caucus. But I will say this, I think that our new Prime Minister has demonstrated over decades in public life his values. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing the evolution of this government in terms of implementing the platform and the policies. And I was just delighted to see that Susan Templeman was delegated to go to Vienna, was able to come to talk to us tonight. Susan's terrific. She's smart, she's experienced, She is hardworking. She represents her community so well. In and of itself, it was great to see Susan representing Australia as an observer at the meeting of the states parties. But even better than that is what Susan represents. And that's that we have an Australian government willing to send an observer to Vienna for that first meeting. So I think that's a really positive sign, and I'm certainly looking very much forward to, as I say, seeing the evolution of this new government and what they can do. So I want to just end where I started by saying thank you. I hope, and I know that you are, but I hope that you all are so proud of what you've achieved in just a few short years. The idea that you could identify the shortcomings of the NPT, assess what needs to be done to create another treaty, another piece of international law, and get enough states to sign and ratify that treaty that would have the status that it has today, and then see those states parties not resting on their laurels, going to Vienna and working hard. I mean, that story about Fiji's participation, other Pacific Island nations' participation, the idea that we've gone from an idea to this reality in a few short years is quite astounding. So thank you, congratulations, and let's keep working. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Terri. And I really need to convey to you that we hold you in the highest esteem, and we thank you for all the work that you have done in this and other areas and for your support. And it's terrific to hear from a parliamentarian who is responsive to the concerns and the wishes of people, right? People like us. One of the things I wanted to say earlier was that ICAN has labelled this the People's Peace Medal. It's not just for ICAN, it's for every one of you and every person around the world who has made an effort. Because without those individual efforts, as Terri said, we wouldn't be where we are today. Sometimes it can be very daunting, sometimes we might give in to despair, but I remind myself, hey, if I give in to despair and everybody else does, then nothing would be achieved. So again, grassroots activity, very important. Thank you. Our next speaker is Cameron Leckie, and I'm delighted to be at another forum where Cameron is speaking. I've heard him speak a number of times before. Cameron is a retired major. He served in the Australian Army for around 24 years. He has come to be a voice which is highly respected, but which has also been critical of some of the decisions that at least previous Australian governments have taken. And for that, I'm grateful, because we do need to have people from within the military, within politics, take a fresh look at things and call out something that is not ethical, that is not moral. So please join me in welcoming Cameron.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to talk tonight. I guess start off, acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we stand. We talk about sovereignty a lot in this country, but we seem to forget that that sovereignty was never ceded historically by the original inhabitants of this land. I was fortunate enough to go to Japan in 2019, just before COVID struck, so timed it really well, about a month before COVID hit. And we went down, took the family down, we went down to Hiroshima. There's two things that struck me. Those that haven't been there, there's a bridge on the lead up to the museum. It's like, it's a funny bridge, it's a T-shape. And you go over the bridge, don't think anything of it on the way there. But then when you get to the museum, you realise that was the aiming point for the aircraft that dropped the bomb. And you think, holy, I just drove over that point and just think that, that happened at that point, that 70 odd years ago. And then when we got inside the museum, like most museums you go to, kids running around, noise, people talking, looking at exhibits and that. The thing that struck me from the time we entered, pretty much to the time we left, I can't really remember a word being spoken. Like, it's just quiet as people sort of walking through and realising, this is what it was all about. This is what happens when we have a nuclear bomb explode on a city. And then you think, you know, as Ian mentioned earlier, we can destroy this planet multiple times over in the next 5 minutes if somebody presses a button. So if that doesn't get you scared, you get worried, that you're concerned about this issue, and I don't think anything would. I guess the comments I want to make, we're living in exceedingly dangerous times. So some of you might have heard of Professor Stephen Cohen, the late Professor Stephen F. Cohen. He was a historian, a scholar of Russia, of the Soviet Union, and of the Cold War. He's actually involved in some of the negotiations towards the end of the Cold War. And in his last years of his life, he'd do regular articles and interviews talking about how dangerous the new Cold War was. And this is obviously before what happened this year. And he says dangerous because a lot of the mechanisms that were established during the first Cold War, which obviously had close calls such as the Cuban Missile Crisis, but a lot of those mechanisms have now been dissolved. So things such as the ABM Treaty, the INF Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, these things no longer exist or in much diluted form. And they were safety mechanisms, so you could establish some trust between two adversaries, which we no longer have. Now we have like demonisation of leaders, diplomatic staff in both countries, in the United States and Russia, being swept away, being evicted from their posts. So basically, you know, there's very little limited lines of communication. There's a lot of room for misunderstandings. And what that means is that, you know, at any time somebody thinks somebody's launched a missile, somebody responds, and then almost by accident we can find ourselves in a global nuclear war and all the consequences that that would entail. So that's pretty scary. And I guess put in context of where we are now, Kishore Mahbani is a Singaporean diplomat, well-respected worker in the United Nations, wrote a book last year calling it The Asian 21st Century, arguing the case that Asia is going to dominate the 21st century, which I agree with. And it's probably a reversion to the historical norms. Look back over thousands of years, Asia has dominated. But we in the West, and you know, particularly Anglo nations, still sort of see the United States as a dominant power. And what I argue, and I've written about this, is that what the Ukraine war has brought about is a rapid acceleration of the transition of power from the Western world to the Eastern world. And if you just want to look at who's sanctioning Russia and who's not sanctioning Russia, India's not, China's not, South America's not, Central Asia's not. It's only the Western countries that are. So we're talking about the bulk of the world's population, largest part of the world's economy, and that's, you know, they might not be supporting Russia's war, but they're certainly not against it, whereas the Western world's weakening itself through sanctions. Back in 2012, I actually wrote an article that published in the Australian Defence Force Journal. One part of that was about the future trajectory of the United States, and I sort of mounted the case that it was on a downwards trajectory. Everything that's happened between now and then only confirms in my view that that's the case. Funnily enough, I also wrote two subsequent essays, one in 2016 and one in 2018. They weren't published, and maybe I was getting a little bit too close to the bone, I think, by that stage. So, I mean, we could talk about one time about why this is the case, but you just look at things such as in 2014, when the Russians said, no, you're not going to take over Ukraine, so they occupied Crimea and supported what happened in the Donbass. That was, I think, the first big marker of that transition. Then you look what Iran did after General Soleimani was killed assassinated in 2020 by the Americans. They fired missiles at US military bases. They caused casualties, didn't kill anyone, caused casualties, and the United States did nothing. That would be unheard of just 10 or 15 years ago. Then you look at Turkey. NATO's largest army is buying Russian air defense systems. Unheard of. You would not think that possible 10 years ago. So these are all external factors of the United States' decline. And then you look at the mess the United States is in, financially, economically, politically, and culturally. It's a mess. And I mean, even the most optimistic person, I would have to mount a really tenuous argument to say that they can turn that around in the short term. But unfortunately, the powers that be in the United States and the greater Western world are not willing to acknowledge this as yet. And this is fundamentally dangerous because we don't live in a unipolar world that we did at the end of the Cold War for the next 20 or 25 years. We now live in a multipolar world. So these major powers need to learn to get along. Otherwise, there's going to be conflict, and obviously very close to that at the moment, what's happening in Ukraine. So this brings me to AUKUS. my view, AUKUS is an anachronism. It's the Anglo nations in fear coming together to try and maintain that grip on global power, which has slipped through their hands. They're trying to maintain it. I see it as a Trojan horse. Australia's involvement is a Trojan horse so that the United States can base nuclear submarines, aircraft, nuclear capable, and their weapons in Australia for their own purposes. And obviously that purpose is about containing China. Now, China's obviously a big nation, a powerful nation with a powerful military. But it's not a military threat. It hasn't demonstrated that for 5,000 years. But what it is a threat to the dominance of the United States. So I think we're almost in a position where the United States needs to bring about a conflict with China to try and undermine it before the United States has gone too far down and can't regain what it's aiming to, being its global dominance. Now, I think it's too late for that. And so I guess one of the things that worries me the most, that a nihilistic foreign policy by the United States could see a war triggered, would rather destroy the world as opposed to live in a multipolar world where the United States is no longer dominant. And that's a real concern for me. So what can we do about it? Well, I guess there's lots of things we can do about it. We can ditch AUKUS, but it's a separate matter. But a real meaningful step would be to sign this treaty. If we sign this treaty that effectively prevent the storage of nuclear weapons on Australia's soil, and that would reduce the chance that the United States will get involved in a conflict in China. And if that does, it reduces the chance that Australia will become a target. Because if there's nuclear weapons based here, you're pretty sure that the Chinese will respond with some sort of attack on Australia, which obviously would be catastrophic. So I guess that's my final point. I'll just make one more point. I'm also a member of Australians for War Powers Reform. Our sole mission is to have the Parliament vote on the decision to go to overseas war. So that is another thing. That's another thing we could do. So we put it in the hands of the Parliament, not in the executive or the Prime Minister alone, to make the decision to go to war. And that once again would reduce the risk that Australia gets involved in a war that will have no positive outcomes for it. Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk tonight.
How wonderful to hear those words. Thank you so much, Cameron. Thank you also for making the point that we really cannot afford to take risks in the way that governments seem to be willing to take them at the moment when it comes to war, to launching weapons. I mean, personally, I think that the US has not acted as well as it should have done. And I do think it has to take some of the blame for the dreadful situation in Ukraine at the moment. Rapidly expanding NATO, willfully expanding it, it really does point to this desperate view to cling on to power at all costs. And Australia does have to think long and hard about the extent to which it wants to be part of that. And I think Cameron's point about AUKUS being a way that we might become even more enmeshed in this madness. These points are very well taken. Thank you, Cameron. Now, our next speaker is someone who will be known to quite a few of you, I expect. Annette Brownlie. Annette has been involved in the peace movement. She, together with Ross Wither and a number of other people, established Just Peace, 20 years ago now. More recently, Annette has been involved, very closely involved, in developing ICAN, the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, which has done some excellent work in just getting voices from ordinary Australians about what do we want our foreign policy to look like? What do we want our strategies for living in peace and harmony? What do we want this to look like? And there have been some fantastic responses to the open polling of views that was put together last year. So, okay, without further ado, I should also note, Annette was the recipient last year of the University of Queensland's Local Agent of peace. And that was a wonderful recognition of the work that was done. Thank you, Annette.
Thank you very much, Marianne. So thanks again for inviting me here as a representative of ICAN, not to be confused with ICAN. Quite often people come up and say, oh, isn't it wonderful, you won the Nobel Prize. ICAN won the Nobel Prize. It's very close, those acronyms. So, you know, we're proud. IPAN is a supporting organisation of ICAN, and we're very proud of that. And tonight I just wanted to to bring to people's minds just how nothing comes from nothing. You know, we stand on the shoulders of people who have done so much work throughout their lives and achieved much in other periods of history. So firstly, I would like to stand on, acknowledge and respect the 60,000 years of the longest continuing culture on Earth. And we often hear the reference to their care for land as being central to the sense of self, and that there is no separation. All nature is one entity. But in contrast to that, we see the absolute opposite of that with the attitudes and behaviours of those in leaderships around the world, in the corporate world. And that's what's being talked about, particularly with what Cameron's just shared. I think there is no sense of belonging to the natural world in those that pursue war. So just a bit of history. My parents, Stan and Flo Irvine, were part of a generation impacted by the Great Depression and war and the birth of the nuclear age following the US bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. My dad, he became politically aware during his war service in New Guinea. And as a result of talk amongst comrades during downtime, and I'm sure Cameron knows about downtime for military people, it's not all action, there's plenty of downtime. He learnt about capitalism's propensity to use war as a tool for both power and profits. His anti-war convictions were hardened with the death of his youngest brother in Bougainville towards the end of 1945. Mum and Dad were among the large post-war peace movement in Australia, who during the late 50s witnessed and experienced McCarthyism in the United States and in Australia. I could tell you stories about that as a child, what was going on in my household at the time. This movement engaged people from all walks of life with strong involvement of the unions, the Communist Party of Australia, Progressive Labor Party members, academics, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as well during that period of time. Peace and nuclear disarmament and protesting uranium mining were strong themes in this era. And I have strong childhood memories of marching in May Day and many other rallies where peace and nuclear disarmament were the dominant theme. Those May Day rallies were huge in the 50s and 60s. My own political awareness and commitment for peace and against war came from them and the movement. The Union of Australian Women morning teas with the likes of Ujaru Nunakul, Ali Elder, and many other strong women were part of my awareness raising, and consolidated with the Vietnam War, which was my, growing up period. My first memory of the Vietnam War was as a 15-year-old. I was working in Queen Street, and one of the early contingents of Australian troops marched down Queen Street. And I remember having a discussion with my co-worker at the time about how wrong this was. And she was saying then, oh, no, this is good. Australia needs to support this war in Vietnam. And we know that over time that changed. And historically, we see movements build in a non-linear fashion. with, for example, the campaign to end slavery and for women's suffrage, which took over a century to achieve what they set out to achieve. And more recently, climate change movements have had a bumpy up and down road. From the 1930s with the initial scientific awareness to the 60s, when there was another spike in interest and awareness. And then again in the early 1990s, when I got very involved in environmental campaigning at that time. And most recently, in the past decade, finally achieving both the tipping points of awareness and, unfortunately, global temperatures. Yeah. So ICAN has achieved a great deal in the last decade, building on the work of people here in Australia and internationally, none more so than the survivors of the nuclear age, the Japanese at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the survivors of Fukushima, the Pacific peoples who suffered the bombing tests, Australia's First Nations people who suffered and survived 12 nuclear tests at Maralinga, Emu Fields and Montebello Islands, and then contributed greatly to the nuclear disarmament movement. The vision for an international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons came from a small group of people in the Medical Association for Prevention of War, which I am a member, having been a nurse all through my life, and grew to them now being illegal under international law. And as it's been reinforced, and that's really amazing, isn't it, over a fairly short period of time for ICAN's activity. There is still much more to do to see them abolished, but we are on our way. Thank you, ICAN. One last little mention that it makes me recall the prophetic words of Margaret Mead, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful and committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Thank you.
Thank you, and that's a great note to end on. You know, I think it's really important, and events like this can help for us to keep that focus. That's all right. And so many of you are doing that, and I think it's absolutely wonderful. Yes, we know that there are still just over 13,000 nuclear weapons. We know that the 9 nuclear weapon states are thumbing their nose at the treaty, but that's not going to happen forever, right? This treaty will bring more and more pressure onto those states, never to use them and to move towards their eventual elimination. They've all promised to do that, by the way, under international law. But we need to just push them in that direction a bit more. So a small group of dedicated